So last we talked about how consumers make choices. Now we're going to start talking about how producers make choices. But one of the things I want to emphasize real quick from the beginning is people are both consumers and producers. So these lessons are actually going to be very similar. You're going to see the same concepts pop up between the last lecture and this lecture, because ultimately we're talking about people here. We're talking ultimately about people. People choose, whether their choices as a consumer when I go to the grocery store, or as a producer. In this case, I produce economic lessons. So I make choices about costs, I make choices about margins to adjust along. So do not fall into the trap of thinking consumers and producers are separate categories. They're not. It all depends on the situation that we're looking at. And oftentimes, even producers, big companies, are producers in one context and buyers in another. Think back to chapter 1. Walmart is a seller, but they're also a buyer. They have to buy goods as well. So these things are not categories that you can just fit into. So let's talk about production costs. And I'm going to remember to share my screen this time. So we're going to define a firm here as an organization that combines labor, capital, land, and other inputs to produce an output. Generally speaking, in the United States and the Western world, most of the world, we have private enterprises where the ownership of the business is by private individuals. That is to say, we have a capitalist society where individuals own the means of production, not governments. There are, of course, exceptions. Frederick Community College, for example, the county government owns the college, so it is not a private enterprise. But for the most part, here in the Western world, we have private enterprises. So firms face many different kinds of competition, competitive situations. And we're going to go into more detail this next week when we talk about the structure of competition. But the basic outlines is we have either perfect competition, which is many firms. At the other end of the extreme is a monopoly, which is only one firm. And then we can have monopolistic competition and oligopoly. We're going to talk more about those next week, so we'll not worry about them right now. And again, like I talked about earlier, we're going to assume that firms are profit maximizing. Profit is your total revenue, which is your price times quantity sold, minus your total costs. And we're talking both explicit costs, such as labor costs, payments, rent, input costs, and implicit costs, the opportunity cost of using your resources. Accounting profit, which is what you are most familiar with, is just your total revenue minus your explicit costs. But your economic profit, which is what we are concerned about, is your total revenue minus all costs, explicit plus implicit. It's quite possible, indeed it happens all the time, that firms are making an accounting profit, but they're not making an economic profit. In other words, the implicit costs tend to be higher than the explicit costs. And so sometimes you might hear of a business that shuts down, go, they were making money. I always saw them. They were always busy. Why'd they shut down? Well, there were better uses for their resources. That would be what the economic profit indicates. If economic profit is negative, then total costs exceed total revenue, so there are better ways to deploy the resources used. So let's think about these things first off in the short run. Production, we're going to say, involves a number of different inputs: land, labor, capital, technology, entrepreneurship, which is the human mind, and natural resources like land and labor. All these things combine together to make a certain amount of output. That's all that this fancy mathematical notation down here means. All these things combine to make some output. There are different kinds of inputs like capital, fixed inputs, factors of production that can't easily be increased or decreased in the short period of time. And then variable inputs that can increase or decrease. Usually we call fixed inputs K for capital, and variable inputs L for labor. Obviously, it's more than just capital and labor, but that's just the shorthand that we use. We are going to define the short run not by a specific period of time, but simply as a period of time during which at least some factors are fixed. We can't build a new factory or build new machinery. And the long run is the time period in which everything is variable. Everything can change. So an example of short-run production might be, in this case, lumberjacks. Output, or what's sometimes called total product, is going to be a function of the labor and the capital that goes in. But capital is fixed. We only have, say, one saw. So we're going to really be talking about adding more people. So what we're concerned here is the marginal product of labor, the additional output that one more worker can produce, MPL. It's defined as the change in total product divided by the change in labor. Generally speaking, as we add more people and we keep capital constant, then the amount that this additional person produces falls, might even go negative. So this top graph here is our total production of trees as we add lumberjacks. The first lumberjack, given the saws that we have, is very beneficial. The first lumberjack can produce 4 trees. When we add a second lumberjack, our total product goes up to 10. So that implies the marginal product of that person is 6. So they were able to add an additional 6 trees. But then it starts going down as we only have so many saws. The third lumberjack doesn't produce as much. The fourth, still less. The fifth adds nothing. So as we added more workers, our actual total product starts to flatten out. And if we were to continue adding, it could actually go negative. So generally speaking, the total product curve has this little S shape, and the marginal product curve has this kind of upside down Nike swoosh. In the short run, the firm faces a bunch of costs. Raw materials, rent, wages and salaries, interest, profit. Profit is a cost. It is the cost that goes to entrepreneurs, the owners of the firm. Just like wages are what go to the laborers, rent is what goes to the owners of the land, raw material prices are what goes to the input owners, and interest goes to the owners of capital. Profit goes to the owners of the firm. Variable costs are the inputs like labor, the ones that vary in the short run, whereas fixed costs do not vary. So the total cost is just your variable plus your fixed costs. Simple enough. We're also concerned about average total cost, which is your total cost divided by quantity, as that will help us determine how profitable the firm is, and the marginal cost, the additional cost of producing one more unit of output. The marginal cost is going to be key there. It's going to be key. Marginal cost is going to help us determine where the profit maximizing point is. So your average, your total cost curve looks something like this. Even at zero output, there are still a certain number of fixed costs, and it generally rises as you increase your output. Variable costs are added to the fixed costs, so the shape represents the shape of increasing variable costs. All this together gives us this nice little cost curve graph. Average total costs tend to be this U-shaped. Average variable costs always lies below the average total cost curve, since average variable costs go into average total costs. And it is also U-shaped, upward sloping. And the marginal cost curve is very much upward sloping, this Nike swoosh. By definition, marginal cost will always intersect average variable and average total cost at their lowest point, because the marginal cost is the cost of one more unit. So as long as marginal cost is below average total cost and average variable cost, those costs must be decreasing. Once marginal cost goes above, then by definition, average costs must be increasing. In the long run, all factors are variable. You can change anything. In the short run, we try to maximize based on what we can adjust. In the long run, we get this more efficient production function because we can now adjust our technology. There are lots of different ways to produce a good. It's not like a cake, usually, but you can do wanting to make a bike, maybe you do it more labor intensive and less machines, maybe more machines and less people. It depends. How firms can combine things, create what we call economies of scale. Small producers, think like a local brewery or a mom and pop shop. They have high average costs. So they tend to charge higher prices. Larger companies, your Walmarts, your Targets, your big companies, they can benefit from economies of scale. Economies of scale mean, generally speaking, your average costs of production are falling as you produce more. So the larger the firm, the lower costs they can get because they can take advantage of these economies, just like we talked about, more division of labor. Of course, it's not a constant thing. Eventually, the long-run average cost curve will start to rise. But depending on the size of the market, some markets might be economies of scale, might be constant returns of scale, might be diseconomies of scale, upward sloping. And so that's what we talk a little bit about here. The number of firms will depend on the market price, whether or not there's economies of scale, etc. So next week, we're going to talk about firm decisions when facing different kinds of competition, monopoly and perfect competition. I'm also going to have a supplemental lecture on what exactly competition is, because the way economists treat it, it's not quite what competition really is. So understanding that is going to be important, but we'll talk more about that next week.